I'm on shaky ground with this episode. It has twice been voted the second greatest story of all time, and even as recently as last year in the Doctor Who magazine's 60th anniversary poll, it was voted the best 10th Doctor story, and while the format of that poll means a direct placement in the overall list of stories wasn't possible, it's fairly good odds it would have been in the top 10 and fairly high up. It's odd, because I'd always thought that the true loving for the episode had sort of faded over the years, what with the returns of the Weeping Angels to increasingly diminishing effect, and the general fall of Moffat's staff, or we saw what happened when he had to actually write the series instead of just one or two episodes. But no, apparently it's as popular as ever, to the point where it managed to come 6th in the truncated story ranking out of that poll. 6th? For statue jump scares? Okay, I should very quickly add before the torches and pitchforks come out that I do think this is a good episode and one which did a lot right. Ultimately, its biggest strength is that it did something very new and unique, and took Doctor Who's format somewhere where it had never been before. Now, granted, you could say the same for Love and Monsters, and we all saw how that turned out, but this does it in a way that adds to the series as a whole, rather than making the viewer embarrassed for even tuning in. But a total classic? One of the best the series has ever done? Really? The point is, I'm not really of that opinion. In my view, New Who is at its best when it focuses on character. Look at Heaven Sent, for instance, pretty much universally agreed as one of, if not the strongest episode of New Who. The whole thing is an hour-long look at one character, and delving deeper than we have ever had been more into the complexities of that character. That's the kind of strength New Who can build on because it fits the structure and style of the show. When most episodes are 45 minutes and the best you usually get is double that, time is of the essence and character is a good basis to do a lot with very little. But Blink's just not really based on that. Our main character is someone who's only around for this episode, so we don't learn that much about her, and she doesn't really have an arc. This episode's biggest weakness, and why I think it's not a true classic as a lot of others do, is because I don't connect with Sally Sparrow, and I don't feel like this episode is about her in any meaningful way. It's about the scares, the mystery, and the unique structure. Much of that works, some of it doesn't, but ultimately it gives the episode a weaker foundation than it probably should have. I see the foundations of a classic here, but in my view it doesn't really make it to the screen. Firstly though, I want to touch on the format of this episode, the Doctor Light, because for all the discussion there's been about this format in the past, there are only actually 3 episodes that used it. Love and Monsters, this episode, and Turn Left. And I'll have other topics to talk about for the other two. In Love and Monsters' case, how I seem to have managed to have reached one of the lower circles of hell. So here we are. The basic idea was to continue making 13 episodes a year, but understanding that's probably too much for the main actors to handle, probably an observation after the production difficulties of the first series. Therefore, having this kind of episode where the Doctor plays an important, but ultimately peripheral role, where the actor for the Doctor, yes, he was only ever Tennant in this format, but the theory was extendable, roll me, could record their scenes for the episode in a few hours, then go on to do other episodes simultaneously, also reducing the amount of time they spent filming on the series overall. The theory is perfectly sound, no question. Production considerations driving storytelling is nothing new, and it was a structure with a great deal of potential. There was one big glaring problem though, and that was that the episode would have to rely on a guest character, which is 2 big risks. Firstly, that because of the New Who episode format, there's only 45 minutes for them to be introduced, developed, go through an arc, and reach conclusion, which isn't a lot of time when you also need to have plot and other things. Secondly, there was the risk they would turn out to be an unlikable arsehole who keeps his girlfriend on a paving slab to give him blowjobs. Yes, Love and Monsters is of course a discussion for another day. Another dark, dark day. But that was a pretty obvious lesson in what not to do. And while Blink is obviously a massive improvement, let's face it could have been a clip of someone projectile vomiting for 45 minutes and it wouldn't have managed that, it does suffer from the first of these 2 issues. Sally is obviously a huge improvement on Nelson in that she's not a terrible person and a moron, but as I said, ultimately her character and the episode is hurt by the lack of time to really develop and grow her. It feels as if they recognised this issue because in the next series they adapted it to pair the Doctor Light with a companion Light episode, so the former could rely on Donna, an established character, and avoid these issues. And the changes to the structure of the series into the Moffat era rendered the format moot, so we never really saw how this went apart from this episode. This was, however, as I said, a format with a great deal of potential because it was telling a kind of story that the show had never really done before. The only time this had been done, in fact, was Mission to the Unknown, and a completely missing 25-minute teaser for another story was probably not the kind of example they really needed. Nevertheless, it was clear even to the makers of New Who this was a golden opportunity to try something a bit different, and they did! Love and Monsters. Second time lucky? The biggest legacy of the Doctor Light format is therefore there was a rare opportunity to truly push the envelope on what the show could be, and do something really different. Blink could never have been done on the classic series, and that's a good thing. In this case, experimenting created something unique and interesting, a different look at how the series could work and what it could be, and whatever this episode's faults, it succeeded at doing that. Therefore, the legacy of this format is one of experimentation. Sometimes it failed, miserably, and sometimes it succeeded. Ultimately, therefore, the format was what allowed the episode to grow and be what it is. Anyway, to the actual episode. As usual, I'm starting with production, but here it's particularly interesting because of how important the production has ended up being to the overall legacy of this episode, given so much of it relies on atmosphere and scares. The director for this episode was Hettie MacDonald, who was bizarrely enough the first ever woman director of the show, which feels like it should have happened sooner, but oh well. Anyway, she did this episode, fucked off for 8 years, then returned to the opening Dalek two-parter of Series 9, which I suppose is one of the odder resumes for directors in the series, 2 unrelated stories and 2 completely different eras, but oh well, that's how it is. Anyway, on a story which rests so much on relying on the right atmosphere and creating the right level of fear, a lot was going to rest on how MacDonald handled her job here. My assessment is mixed. In a lot of places there is tension and the requisite creepiness, and in terms of the fear factor this episode has been praised for, I think insofar as watching it the best part of 2 decades later with an adult's eyes rather than that of a child, the intent is there, as a lot of it does come up on the screen. There are certainly moments where it's ramped up to be effective. The problem though is this is neither something that is maintained throughout the episode, nor is it particularly something that is consistent even within the individual scenes. For instance, when Sally and Shaggy make their way to the TARDIS, the initial scenes where they are being pursued by the Angels are quite effective. But as soon as they're in the TARDIS, we cut to the silly looking exterior shots of them rocking the TARDIS back and forth, which, additionally to looking ridiculous, does not make a goddamn lick of sense, but we'll get to that. And when the TARDIS dematerialises, the shots of the Angels crowding round them equally look pretty silly and unthreatening. Going to the start of the episode instead is another issue I ended up having. The things just become sort of drawn out. The scene where Sally's friend is in the house about to be spirited away by the Angels is initially quite tense as she's separated from Sally, dealing with the guy at the door ripping off that bit in Back to the Future, and we get the sense that something bad is about to happen without knowing exactly what. The problem is it just goes on too long. More of Sally arguing with Back to the Future man and her friend mooching around the house. Sally's argument in the end becomes tedious and we lose our interest in the initial tension about what's going to befall her friend. If it had been half as long, it would have been more effective. Now, naturally, some of it is a script, but the pacing also does come down to the director as well. Ultimately, though, any evaluation of the directing job on the episode requires seeing it through the lens that it came out of, that we all saw in 2007, when all of us were children, including myself. I was 9 years old at the time, and then, yeah, I remember it being fairly scary. Add in that anything else becomes less scary if you see it enough times and know what's coming. That what was scary in 2007 probably wouldn't manage quite the same effect today regardless. The much of the audience that lauded that fear factor so much are now adults and less susceptible to it, and also that the novelty of the Angels has worn off after their repeated and mostly deeply unimpressive reuse. It's not difficult to see why it might be a bit difficult to judge this component of the episode, and therefore fairly judge the person whose responsibility it was, i.e. the directors, with any great deal of fairness. I'll admit that this watch, and it was my first in quite a long time, so it's not as if all the scares were fresh in my mind, I was not scared at any point. But again, I'm now 26, it might have been more effective when I was 9. Objectively, a lot of the scares come from jump scares, which are in my view the lowest form of horror, and not all that impressive, but again, a lot of it comes from the psychological and atmospheric aspects, and as I said earlier, that does have some level of effectiveness. Again, as I said though, it is difficult to be truly objective. The thing is though, I'm not sure how much of an excuse this really is. The brilliance of Doctor Who's most effective classics is something that holds up to this day. The focus on character, plots, themes, stuff like Genesis of the Daleks, Caves of Androzani, Heaven Sent. None of them are stuff I have to excuse like I do here. Sure, some of the effects in the classic stories don't hold up, and Heaven Sent's more Moffat-y dialogue moments can cringe, but they're very minor things that don't detract from the overall pieces. Nothing is completely perfect. But for Blink, it relies on this. It has a dependence on being scary and being effective because of that. And the fact that it's questionable whether it really is or not, it just drags it down. It's not as effective as it used to be, and I'm not sure I can accept the idea that it's an all-time classic based on it used to be scary. And that's my view at least. Anyway, the only other element of the production I want to talk about is the music. It's fitting actually that in the last video I talked about another of Doctor Who's regular composers, Dudley Simpson, and said that I felt his music was too safe and samey a lot of the time. It's not quite the same complaint I have with Murray Gold, which I'll get to in my next sentence, but I think it's interesting to compare how these long-time composers can end up bringing up similar complaints. My issue with Gold, see, told you I'll get to it in this sentence, is that he's very good at music that's big and bombastic, that has an enormous sense of scale and is meant to convey that. This is Gallifrey, for instance, introduced this series, is an excellent example of how well that can work. The problem is that I don't think he was all that great at any other kind of music, and this creates two problems. Firstly, this tends to make his music feel just as samey as Simpsons, to the point where I was listening to some of the soundtrack for the BBC series of His Dark Materials, found a particularly tragically beautifully sounding scene for what was clearly meant to be an emotional moment. I never really watched most of the series, I was just sort of going through music, don't ask me why. I'm thinking, why isn't there anything like this in Doctor Who? And the answer is simply because Murray Gold is only really good at a few sounds, and that kind of thing just ain't him. Secondly, it means when an episode forces him into a situation where he needs to do another kind of music, it ends up just not really fitting. He goes sort of with an over-the-top judgery type music, and it just ends up being silly and killing the tension. Something subtle and haunted was needed, and we don't get that. We get over-the-top and fairly mood-killing. I made that seem like I don't like Gold's music, and I do. A lot of it is really good and iconic for the series. It's not using him at all I object to. It was just the over-reliance on him to the point where he scored all but 3 series of the revival, and will no doubt keep scoring along as the series continues with its current creative staff. And it just means that in episodes like this, where something outside of his comfort zone was really called for, we just don't get it. When he's in that comfort zone, such as for the final 3 episodes of the series, he's amazing. Here it comes across as over-the-top and silly. Anyway, that's the production, now onto the script. Hooray. Now, obviously you all know this was written by Steven Moffat, and we all know what he did for the show, there's no point going through that rigmarole here. I've also made my opinion on his time as showrunner fairly clear over the course of these videos, so I'm not going to dwell on that either. I'll simply point out that in my view there's a reason that there's a more mixed reaction to his time as a showrunner compared to his RTD1 era episodes. And that's because his weaknesses as a writer were less pronounced when A, he was focused on single episodes and stories, and B, when he had other creatives making the big calls and therefore reining his excesses in. And yes, while much of it is far from flawless, his RTD1 work is generally good and has a positive legacy. This episode in particular is a sort of a great way of exploring him as a writer and his strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, this episode is a great demonstration of his ability to come up with good ideas, unique structures and plots, and create interesting and unique stories as a result. On the other hand, we see the bad comedy, awkward dialogue, questionable logic, and inconsistent characterization that have become the primary issues of his era as showrunner, albeit here reined in a bit. It's very much a demonstration of his writing in all its aspects, and while the fact that it succeeds despite itself is a testament to the talent, and that his era ended up being quite so mediocre, showing how he probably needed a guiding hand to use that talent as much as it could have been. I'll split this bit into 2 sections, the good and the bad. Unfortunately, a third category, the ugly, was rejected for just not really having anything to fit into it, and also ripping off a Clint Eastwood movie. Firstly, one of the biggest strengths of the episode is how it builds up a very effective mystery and keeps the tension going as a result. We actually do learn precious little in the first half of the episode. Things happen, but we don't get an explanation for why and how, and that's a good thing. The vagueness leads to dread, and the mystery is a very unique way of doing things, particularly in New Who, which has to be paced so quickly because of the 45-minute time limit. The nature of these statues, it's shrouded in mystery, and it's done very effectively that we only learn everything as Sally does. I also like the introduction of the Doctor on the TV. Sally just walking into the DVD shop to find Shaggy, and suddenly there's David Tennant in the background. If it wasn't him doing it, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't even notice, it would just be background noise. Bear in mind, this is the first we see of the Doctor throughout the whole episode, apart from the writing on the wall, so it's just another intriguing tease, and the subsequent explanation only adds to it. We learn things at a steady and satisfying pace, and this does create an effective mystery, and one the viewer is eager to learn more about. I'll also add the pacing of the episode as a major strength. I think it goes at pretty much exactly the right speed. It never makes the viewer bored, and the only times it feels like it's going too fast is when it comes to things that just weren't really avoidable because of the 45-minute format. The Weeping Angels themselves are also here quite an effective villain. Yes, I know, their later appearances are going to make most of what I say here look ridiculous, but based on this episode alone, I think on the surface they're an extremely interesting monster. Now, I have a lot of logic-based complaints about them I will be making shortly, hence the on-the-surface bit, but arguably given the nature of the episode, I'd say that's more important to their overall presentation. The episode's not really about them, they're simply tools in it, and therefore, I think having them portrayed sort of as surface-level villains, that's not a massive problem. Where it became a massive problem was later on when they returned, but never mind. Their look is striking, their abilities unsettling and creepy, and they're actually a very subtle monster by New Who standards, which I do really like. They're silent, their monstrous status entirely through their nature and their actions. It's sort of the antithesis of the catchphrase villain I said in the last New Who review. The Wire was loudly constantly repeating her catchphrase, but had no depth or menace to her. The Angels say nothing, and I note have very few characteristics that could be repeated in the playground by children, a rare thing for this era. Instead, the menace comes across simply by what they are and what they do. They just stand there as statues, and suddenly they've done their dirty deeds to you before you even know it. That idea, and how it does translate into the episode, I think is really interesting and effective. Along with the very idea of them in the first place, taking something as harmless yet sometimes unnerving as a statue, that's a very Holmesian idea and one that fits right with Doctor Who. I think despite the later complaints I'll have, that overall they're an effective monster for the episode. And this episode is precisely where they should have stayed, and their repeat appearances mostly did away with all that was effective about them, leaving only the questionable logic behind, but hey ho. Related to that, the idea of sending people back in time forever is an idea that I think could have ended up as tired and annoying, but I actually did like the spin Moffat put on it here. The two people we see sent back in time, they ended up having happy and fulfilling lives, and it's made very clear that neither of them truly have regrets about that. It would have been so easy just to show it as a truly horrible fate worse than death, and that's what you might think it would be. Hell, if I was sent back to 1920 no one was to come, I'd find a nice big rock to hide under and stay there for the rest of my life. But it would have ultimately cheapened the episode. It would have been more about that fate and the dangers of it, rather than the personal interactions with Sally, and how they let her see the nature of it in a way that complements her growth, and allows the story to progress naturally. It leads to more of a subtle tragedy than an outright one. These people were snatched from their lives, but ultimately ended up leading lives that they could be happy with. Enough to show us the danger and loss that the angels cause, but not to take it too far. This I do like. Another plus for me is, as I said earlier, the unique and experimental structure of the episode. Unlike the previous Doctor Light story, which had been a what if we saw a normal Doctor Who episode through the eyes of a complete arsehole who is paving slab sex, this takes a completely different approach, essentially telling the story of what if someone else was playing the role of the Doctor. It's a subtle one because Sally very quickly approaches things differently from the Doctor, so it takes a very different path, but the setup is the same. She finds a mystery, finds some monsters, and has to stop them through intelligence and courage. I think that's a unique and effective setup. It's something we'd never seen before, so therefore adds to the overall tapestry of the episode. Because we ultimately seen things through different perspectives, it means as Doctor Who is we've never really been done before, something the classic series certainly never have touched, and even a novelty for New Who at this point. Ultimately, Blink is still a unique episode. Doing it the way it did, it's not been done since either, and therefore I think it does hold an important and special place because of that. I think if this had become like a regular feature, just doing random person gets involved in a Doctor Who adventure, I think that would have diminished its effect, but because this is such a unique thing, I think it does hold up because of that. The structure also works in setting up an actually quite a clever time loop. Now, some of the individual components don't really work logically, as we'll get to, but in terms of everything coming round again and forming the complete circle, it works remarkably well. Everything has been thought about and brought back into the loop, and it comes together quite effectively. Maybe it's a small thing, but a time loop is a tricky thing to do right, and here I think Moffat at least manages to keep the circle working. It wouldn't have taken much for it to fall apart, but it avoids that, and it's good because I think it probably would have taken much of the story with it, but here it feels complete. So, there are my positives. Before I go too deeply into the negatives, I just want to address a few smaller things. Firstly, yeah, there's some bad Moffat comedy, such as when Shaggy and Sally first meet, which involves the former accidentally flashing the latter, which is the kind of thing you'd never do as a joke nowadays, and thank Christ, because it barely qualifies as one. There's bad Moffat dialogue, of course. This is where the Tumblification of Doctor Who truly began with that dreadful wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey quote, the utter stupidity of which is only eclipsed by the inability to take it seriously, which seriously yanks the viewer out of an otherwise quite tense and effective scene. It felt like the idea of having a good quote to put on Tumblr, and of course merchandise, became more important than actually telling a good story, but I digress. That's stuff that's both more important to discuss in the Moffat era itself, of which this is not part, and overall not that important to the points I do want to make regarding the negatives I have for this episode. There are two major things I want to discuss. Firstly, the logic, because for all its strengths, so much of this episode has not made the tiniest bit of fucking sense, and ultimately this mostly revolves around the Weeping Angels. Yes, I said, on the surface they're effective, and that's kind of what matters here, and indeed they are effective in that way. It's just when you think about them for more than a second the whole thing starts to fall apart. Firstly, I'm sorry, but when it comes to creatures with such a bizarre biology and specific powers as a result, this is naturally going to lead to questions as to where the hell they came from. Because evolution doesn't work as a random feature generator. It works as a result of selecting features as a result of survival and extinction. Turning to stone in a way that prevents you from ever looking at a member of your own species feels like it's not exactly Darwinism at its finest, so this is clearly some kind of artificial enhancement. But this begs the question of how and why. Now, I should make abundantly clear the vagueness and mystery is part of the effectiveness of the Angels, so obviously I'm not suggesting going for a full-on exposition explanation about how they came from the planet Zog and were made by Merlin using voodoo or whatever. That would obviously be ridiculously out of place. But equally, just allowing these questions to build with a lame toss-off answer of, oh, they're old, nobody really knows, it just means the questions dominate. Again, this does not need to be over-explained, but I think changing over a few lines of dialogue, something along the lines of some people think they're the result of a biological experiment gone wrong. Some people think they're a weapon that got out of hand. Some simply think they're an evolutionary dead end that simply can't go extinct because of what they are. Nobody knows. I think saying something like that would work much better. Acknowledging that these questions will be asked, but they don't make much sense without them, but still avoiding directly answering them, keeping the creepy mystery about them. It acknowledges that the question of their origin has been asked, but that nobody knows the answer. I think that's more effective than what we got, which is not really asking at all. The angels' behaviour themselves also beg similar questions. For instance, they freeze into stone whenever they're observed by a living creature. So what, if an amoeba or something happens to be observing them, they freeze? Or is there like a cut-off here as to what counts? If a flea is observing one, does it freeze? How about an insect like an ant? A rat? A dog? Or does it have to be an intelligent creature? In a bit I mentioned earlier, when they're trying to get into the TARDIS, the light sometimes comes on and they're in their stone form, while the only two other characters in the scene are inside the TARDIS, so who's observing them? Do they freeze when they're observed by the audience? Or is there like a rat in the corner looking at it or something? Leaving this unanswered doesn't create a mystery, it just makes no fucking sense. And of course there's this bit.
In the sight of any living thing, they literally turn to stone. And you can't kill a stone.
Yes you can. With like a sledgehammer, or even like a big metal pole or something, you could probably knock its head off with that. Now, granted, this doesn't help Sally and Shaggy in this particular situation here, but in general this is not really all that accurate, and the Doctor might be confusing stone for titanium. Equally, I've never understood why they can't look at each other based on what we're told here. Yes, they can't move when they're observed by other living creatures, but we've established when they're stone, they're not living creatures, they're just stone, so how would that work? Honestly, I can't even wrap my head around it, unless the idea is they're just sort of going into a repeat cycle that eventually leads to Angel 4 Error 404. I don't really understand. Answers on a postcard, please. Oh, and this is one that's bugged me since I first watched this episode when I was 9 years old. Shaggy needs to look at the angel while Sally finds a way out. He looks at it, trying not to blink, desperately trying to avoid blinking. And all I can think is, wink, you dumb moron! You can still wet your eyes, the things that makes you want to blink, without closing both eyes at once, you utter pillock! Does anyone in the Doctor Who media involving the Angels ever think of this? Surely someone, and by someone I of course mean the writers, not the actual characters, must have cottoned on, oh yeah, there's this other thing you can do with your eyes that doesn't require closing both of them. And I'm sorry, if you're saying, well, it's the heat of the moment, he might not think of it, if he can't think of a way to easily solve this problem while staring down a one-way trip to the arse end of time, then he deserves to end up in the middle of the Black Death or wherever this particular angel was keyed to. Again, this is not something my over-analysing adult mind is thinking of now. I thought of this when I first watched the episode, 17 years ago when I was 9 years old. If I thought of it then it's probably a bit of a hole. Now, admittedly, this is more of a not adding up stuff rather than fundamental storytelling problems, although they are still problems. The fact you'd have to change essentially how the basics of the Angels work to fix them is kind of an issue in itself. But a bigger issue is how inconsistently the Angels act. Half the time they're fast enough that it includes huge distances in the amount of time it takes to blink, but sometimes it takes them the best part of a minute to cross the same distance, whichever is more convenient for the plot. Sometimes they just pounce immediately, sometimes they let people walk past them with their backs to them for shits and giggles. This kind of inconsistency matters a lot more because it cheapens them. It seems as if they're only allowed to be as effective as the script says they are. If that's the case, then ultimately they're not going to be as much of a threat as they should be. There's also stuff not directly related to the Angels. For instance, the Doctor knows what Sally is going to say for the video, we get that, but how does he know exactly how quickly she's going to say it and how long she's going to leave when she buggers off to go speak to Shaggy in between sentences with him? Ultimately, it doesn't quite come across as well as it should, although the scene when they have the conversation still works overall simply because of the unique nature of it and how it builds up tension. I think it feels a little too natural, a little too like it's just a normal conversation despite its nature. This might be a directing failure rather than anything else, that maybe Tennant's performance should have been a little less matched up to Mulligan's, that his tone of voice sometimes doesn't quite match where hers left off. That's something I think they should have done, but I don't know, it just feels a little too safe as it is. The time loop also, despite working overall, is used to cover up some pretty dubious assertions. It is just written off with, well, they knew that was going to happen. Like the angels looking at each other when the TARDIS leaves them behind. That's a hell of an assumption to make, and kind of a dick move to leave Sally and Shaggy to their mercies if it doesn't work. And I get the impression the time loop is sort of being used as an excuse to justify this kind of a logic. Ultimately, though, this stuff just leaves enough gaps in the episode, but it means it's difficult to sit back and enjoy because you're thinking, well, that makes no sense, or why does that happen? It feels like in the end Moffat had an idea and sort of contorted it to fix the story box he wanted rather than allowing it to take its own course, and this became a fairly common theme throughout his time as showrunner, unfortunately. Now, I could say where that should have taken its course to, but frankly it's not my job to write the episode for him, so I don't care. All I'm saying is that logic gaps are distracting for me and prevent me from enjoying it as much as I should. Because all I'm thinking of in the middle of the most important scene of dialogue is, why is he saying you can't kill a stone? You can kill a stone. An entire age of human history was based on the fact you can kill a stone. You get the idea. Anyway, the other negative I wanted to talk about is perhaps a bit more indicative of why I feel this episode isn't really the classic many think it is. Ultimately, I don't think Sally Sparrow is a particularly strong character, and the reason for that is that I don't really think she goes through much of an arc throughout the episode. She starts off as a person who goes to old houses and takes photographs, and she ends as someone who co-owns a DVD shop. Yeah, it's not really a natural arc progression, is it? It doesn't really feel like she changes or grows, just that she's there throughout the story going through the motions the plot needs her to. So little of it feels as driven as it should. Now, I think I may know what the idea of what they were going for is, that she learns the need for happiness and fulfillment and learns that from the people sent back in time that can happen regardless of circumstance. But I don't get the feeling at the beginning of the episode she's someone who needs to learn that. I don't get the feeling throughout the episode she is learning that, really. And I don't get the feeling at the end of the episode that she has learnt it. The only change is that she now owns a DVD store. Which, brilliant investment for the future, by the way. In 2008, DVD stores can only go up from there. And that's kind of it, really. I don't think her relationship with Shaggy was also developed enough to be believable that she'd end up together with him. Especially given how they started with the whole flashing thing. Yeah, I know, it was an accident, he didn't mean to, but yikes. Again, not the joke you'd be allowed to make today. Anyway, I just don't think Sally has given any real growth or change. She is just what she is, and I'm frankly not sure her character is that well defined enough for that to work. We basically just get generic character traits. She's smart, courageous, but not really anything else. Also, as an aside, Carey Mulligan's performance as Sally is, I don't know, there's something about her delivery. It's just a bit off for me. I can't really put my finger on exactly why, but it's something that just doesn't work. I wish I could pinpoint it because I sound a bit like less of an idiot here, but it just doesn't really work for me. Ultimately, though, I'm not sure any of the characters in this really get much, and that's part of the problem as well. Shaggy's just a pretty generic 2000s internet guy, and his only real arc is learning how not to blink because he's a moron who hasn't heard of winking, and most of the others are bit parts. Hell, I think the only character I say does get any real arc is Billy Shipton, who goes from being a pretty shameless ladies' man who's having to flirt with somebody he's just met while on shift as a police officer, to becoming a happy and devoted husband throughout his life, learning the value of true connections and all that. It's small, but it actually does sort of work. Oh, and fun fact, the actor who played Old Billy played one of the Merstrans in Planet of Evil, so there's a bit of trivia. And as for the regulars, well, the Doctor's only really here to exposit, and frankly I think he's in it a bit too much. His bit of exposition to Billy explaining what we've already kind of worked out is one of the episode's few structural missteps. It explains away much of the remaining mystery, and I think that's sort of stuff that could have been developed naturally in sort of the remaining part until they get to the house. And then there's Martha, who gets about 10 lines in the whole episode, so there's nothing to talk about for her. Again, though, it's the Dr. Light episode. It's not about them, and it doesn't need to be. But it brings up the main problem I have, and what I think the main structural weakness of the Dr. Light format is. Ultimately, with only 45 minutes to play with, introducing, developing, and growing new characters is to rest the entire story on, it's not going to be an easy task. Despite my thinking that Sally needs much more growth to be effective, where's the room for it? The pacing, while effective, is pretty quick, and it'd lose that effectiveness if it got any quicker. The only way to really solve my issues with this episode would be, well, to make it a two-parter, to devote far more time to Sally's character growth and relationships, and to allow more time for the Fretty Angels to be better defined. But given the point of it to free up one episode in the schedule, it was just never going to be the case. The format just was not going to allow that, so perhaps for me it was doomed before it even began. Doomed isn't the right word, though. Because overall, despite my issues, I think it's a pretty solid episode. It is smart, unique, tense, creepy, and has an effective story and mystery. As an all-time classic, though, I don't see it. I think it's too dependent on the scare factor to be elevated beyond decent, and that isn't there for me now. In the year 2024, when I'm no longer a kid watching this with a kid's eyes, yeah. Without that, it's just an interesting episode, and, well, there are plenty of those even in New Who. It's actually been an interesting episode to talk about for the reason that it's good for different reasons than New Who usually is when it manages to be good. And indeed, the uniqueness in many ways is what elevates this episode, but ultimately I think it's just not quite as well thought out as it should have been. An interesting and in many ways successful experiment, but for me, not among the very best. With all that said, and bearing in mind the final score is just a measure of how this episode compares to the rest of New Who, it's not a measure comparing it to anything else other than all the other New Who episodes and the average that creates, I'm awarding Blink a final score of 8 out of 10. It's flawed, the characters aren't great, the logic hole's huge, and it relies on the fear factor that probably isn't as strong as it once was, but it makes up for that, with unique and fresh ideas, an interesting structure, an effective mystery, and excellent pacing that makes this an enjoyable episode that's one of New Who's more unique and bold experiments. For that we should be grateful. It might not be an all-time great in my eyes, but it is Doctor Who unlike we've ever had before, and we've ever had since. And I think for that alone it deserves some recognition.